Can we actually pull up Family Jewels so I can get a timeline in my head just exactly? Because there's a lot going on in
Mhm.
this handful of years there.
Yeah, the 70s, especially for the 1975 is called the Year of Intelligence. So the end of 74 is the Rockefeller Commission, 75 is the Church and Pike Committees.
Right. So investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, all right, this is what I want, revealed some of the contents of the Family Jewels in a front page New York Times article in December 1974. This is why I wanted to check it.
Mhm.
Because Gottlieb destroys
Yes.
documents in 73.
Yep.
So long before Hirsch
Yeah.
presumably gets a hold of
Yeah,
this.
and go
What led him to do we know
Yes.
what the thought process
Yeah,
was there?
I
in
think I
destroying
do
them?
because these depositions, thankfully.
Please tell us.
Yeah, so in 1973, Sidney Gottlieb is retiring from the CIA. So he's retiring. So he's leaving, and so is Richard Helms, who was the director of the CIA. Richard Nixon was kind of pushing Richard Helms out, and so Gottlieb goes to Richard Helms and asks him, "What are we going to do with all this stuff?" Because Richard Helms had been a big proponent of MKUltra throughout its career. And they both agree that they're going to destroy the files before they retire because now that they're not going to be there, they don't want anyone to leak this to the press, So they basically have them incinerated. They take them to a CIA records center, and the archivist at the records center writes a note saying, "Over my stated objections, Richard Helms, directed Sidney Gottlieb to have me destroy these files." So, we have the document of the archivist saying, "I didn't want to do this, but I was directed to do this." So they destroy the files in 1973. Then all this other stuff happens. Rockefeller, Church, Pike Committee. And as part of that, Sidney Gottlieb is subpoenaed and he has to testify in front of those. And he's in India at the time. He's working at like a leper colony. He comes back, he testifies. He doesn't say that much, but in these depositions, he says a lot more. Joseph Rao, this attorney, presses him and Richard Helms, who his deposition I also found. He presses them asking.
Helms was in there too.
Yeah, Helms. And the CIA really tried to prevent Helms's deposition from happening. And even when it did happen, they tried to prevent Rao from keeping a copy. They said, "Oh, he accidentally released classified information. We're going to have to take your copy of that." And
Conveniently.
Rao said, "There's no way."
Yeah.
Because the thing they said was classified was the location of a CIA, some building or something, which had already been published in the Washington Post. And it's like, that's not, it's already public information.
Don't try that.
Yeah.
What year was this again?
This is like 79 is when it
79,
starts, but the
right.
depositions mainly happen in 80 to 83.
Okay, so early 80s.
Yeah.
But where did they take place again?
Mainly in like Virginia and DC.
Okay.
Yeah, where most of these people are. But I was saying, in the depositions, Joseph Rao, this attorney, who's a fiery attorney, he gets into arguments with them. He is so combative. He starts like bad mouthing the other attorneys in there. He's a great character for the book. And at this point, he's an older gentleman. He had been involved in like the civil rights, movement, and he had faced a lot of things over his career. And so he wanted this to kind of be the last notch on his belt. He asked Sidney Gottlieb and Richard Helms, "Why did you destroy these files? Obviously it seems like you wanted to cover something up." At first, Gottlieb gives this excuse of an explanation. He says, "Well, the CIA was drowning in paper. We just had so much of it that, we were trying to downsize a little bit. And so we had to destroy these files just to get rid of so much paper that we couldn't hardly move."
God.
Yeah. So obviously he's just saying this.
Yeah.
So Rao keeps pressing him. "You got to be kidding me, So Richard Helms says, "Well, one reason we did it is because we wanted to protect sources and methods. That's our prerogative, as disclosed in the National Security Act. We got to protect sources and methods. These documents have the names of people on there and what we're doing, so we have to protect sources and methods." And Rao pushes him like, "You couldn't just keep them secret? Like, how does destroying them protect sources and methods when keeping them secret doesn't? Just don't give them to the public. You can protect sources and methods without destroying every file you have." So that doesn't really go over too well with Rao. And then in a deposition with Sidney Gottlieb again, he asks him, he really pushes him, "Really, what's going on here? Like, why?" And Sidney Gottlieb basically breaks down during the deposition and he says, "I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed about what we did." He came to have regrets because he realized it didn't amount to hardly anything. They didn't really learn anything from MKUltra. They spent millions of dollars and harmed untold numbers of people, causing lasting abuse throughout their lives, in some cases, like Frank Olson, causing them to die. And what came of it? Basically nothing. And so Sidney Gottlieb was embarrassed about it. And so he didn't want anyone to know because he didn't want it to cause backlash to the CIA, but also to him. So he destroyed them.
And it could go deeper than that, but we don't know. That's why it's another one of those. It's like, oh man, I wish not even on camera. I wish I could just sit with a guy like that who's obviously dead now, long dead, but like you just sit with him in a room like this for a few hours and pick his brain and see what they're about. Because, people, you stay here long enough with people, and usually it's for the better, to be honest with you, because I'm lucky to have mostly really, really great people come through here. But you get to know who people are. You see what they're about. You see what makes them tick and things like that. And I'd love to think as an American, if there were some serious mistakes made and things that were done totally wrong in a program like this, that the people who did it would have recognized that and would have voluntarily tried to stop it, and it wouldn't have just been like a cover-up campaign. But, that's probably wishful thinking with some of these people, and he is at the top, so it's certainly suspect when you look at this. Like, okay, I understand you're protecting yourself, but why are you destroying all those documents? And then, it's very interesting to hear you talk about the depositions and how open he was and how much he wanted to talk about it. That's almost psychotic in a way.
I think he changed. I think he really came to regret MKUltra.
Oh, you think he regretted it?
I think so. At the time he was doing it, I think he thought this was in service of national security. And after it was over, I still think he thought that was a legitimate cause, but I think he came to realize that it didn't do anything and you harmed all these people.
Right.
Toward the end of his life, he was well known throughout his community for volunteering at all kinds of places. And a lot of the people who knew him, they were interviewed afterwards, and they said, like, we always thought he was trying to absolve himself of past sins or something like that.
There it is.
I think he did have pangs of conscience. Like I said, he was in India volunteering at a leper hospital for a long time, for a couple of years before he came back. And I think he really came to regret it.
Well, that's nice. There's something good there, I guess. But, along the way, and we keep on talking about it in different examples, but there are victims of things like this. There are victims in things like Midnight Climax. There are people. They're among the plaintiffs in a case like that in the early 80s. But I forget, you had said you talked to some victims, some alleged victims in your interviews, or
I have the depositions of several of the victims.
Okay.
I think all the victims are probably dead by this point.
right, because this was a while ago. But are there family members I don't know much about this? Are there family members who are publicly speaking out about what their dead relatives told them, happened in this? And those dead relatives are actually people who are traceable to real cases, and it's not just, someone yelling on Twitter?
Yeah, it's hard. There is, like I mentioned, a lawsuit that the children of people, they claim to be the children of people who are in this sub-project by Ewan Cameron in Montreal. I haven't really looked into that, so I don't know. So, I don't know too much about that, but I know those children are trying to sue the Canadian government, I think, because the Canadian government was also giving funds to Ewan Cameron, like grants and things. So I know that's going on. But when I talk about the victims in this book, it mostly comes from the depositions that happened, because not only, were the perpetrators of MKUltra deposed in this, but the victims talk about everything that they went through in these depositions. One of the more moving cases is of this woman named Mary Morrow. She was one of the patients of Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a victim of psychic driving and sleep deprivation, and especially electroshock therapy. The ironic thing with her story, which makes it such a good story to illustrate what's going on in these experiments, is that she had been one of the residents in training at the Allen under Ewan Cameron doing these things to other people. And she said, so her story is really sad. She had gone to medical school. She wanted to be a neurologist. She developed anorexia. She wasn't able to pass her neurology exams. And so the person who got her the position that she really wanted, the head of the neurology department at St. Mary's Hospital, he eventually had to take all her patients because she couldn't, handle them, because she failed her exams. She didn't have her license. She eventually tried to kill herself. And then she went to a hospital, basically, to try to get better. And while she was there, Ewan Cameron comes and he says, I'd like you to come back to the Allen, but not as a resident, but as a patient. So she had been on one side of it, and then she goes back as a patient. And so she talks about what it was like being on the other side. She doesn't remember that much because the main thing that was done to her was the electric shock therapy. And so what eventually happened to her was her sister and her mother would talk to her on the phone after these sessions, and she was obviously incoherent and not in her right mind. And so her mother told her sister, you go down there and figure out what's happening. So her sister barges in, and they try to prevent her from seeing Mary Morrow. And she says, I'll call the police. I don't care. I'm seeing my sister. So she goes to see her sister, and her sister doesn't even recognize her when she walks in the room. Or Mary Morrow doesn't recognize her sister when her sister walks in. She doesn't know how to put on her clothes anymore. She can't put on makeup or do her hair or anything. She is, just completely gone. Over time, she eventually recovers some, but she eventually tries to commit suicide again. She tries to sue Ewan Cameron, but she's prevented from doing so, mostly because he has, connections with all the people who are in Montreal, basically. And, he's preventing them from giving her a job and preventing her from going forward with this. And, it's just a really sad story, but it's a good light through which to view these experiments in particular, since she was on both sides of it.
Yeah. Wow, that's like a full circle one right there. But thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.